Now your brain is gonna have 3 meninges that are gonna be protecting either your brain and your spinal cord, or in general your central nervous system. So we're gonna start with the outermost layer, which is the dura mater. Then we have the middle layer called the arachnoid mater, and the innermost layer, which is the pia mater, which is in close relationship to the brain. Now in the dura mater has 2 layers. There's going to be a periosteal layer, which is the outermost layer that covers the inner surface of the bones that form the cranial cavity. And then there is a meningeal layer or inner layer, in which the dura mater proper faces the brain. So these 2 layers are closely united, except when they are separated from the dural venous sinuses. Now the dura mater has these invaginations or layers that are formed within your brain. The first one that we see here, it's called the falx cerebri, which is a sickle-shaped fold that lies in the longitudinal fissure between the right and left cerebral hemispheres. We also have another structure called the tentorium cerebelli, which is a crescent-shaped fold that roofs over the posterior cranial fossa and separates the cerebellum from the occipital lobes of the cerebral hemispheres. Also, we have another structure called the falx cerebelli, which is a small sickle-shaped fold in the posterior cranial fossa that separates or projects between the right and left cerebellar hemispheres. And lastly, we also have a diaphragmocella, which is a small circular fold that forms the roof of the sella turcica, right here. And it has a small opening for the pituitary stalk. Now let's talk about the dural venous sinuses. These are located between the inner and outer layers of the dura mater, and they receive blood from the brain via the superficial and deep cerebral veins, as well as cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space via the arachnoid granulations. The blood in here is collected by the dural venous sinuses, and it drains ultimately into the internal jugular veins. So first of all, we have the superior sagittal sinus, which runs along the upper border of the falx cerebri, and it begins anteriorly at the foramen cecum, and then terminates posteriorly in the confluence of the sinuses. We also have an inferior sagittal sinus, which runs along the lower free border of the falx cerebri, and it drains into the straight sinus. We also have a transverse sinus, which begins in the confluence of the sinuses and runs along the posterior border of the tentorium cerebelli. And when it reaches the petrous part of the temporal bone, it turns down to become continuous with the sigmoid sinus. We also have the sigmoid sinus, which is a continuation of the transverse sinus, and it terminates in the jugular foramen, where it becomes continuous with the internal jugular vein. And we also have an occipital sinus, which is a small sinus that runs along the posterior border of the falx cerebelli, and it ends superiorly in the confluence of the sinuses and inferiorly communicating with the internal vertebral venous plexus within the vertebral canal. Another structure we gotta look at is the cavernous sinus. That structure, it's located in the middle cranial fossa on each side of the sella turcica. So you can see it there and here. It drains the contents of the orbit, parts of the cerebral hemispheres, the pituitary gland, which is actually located in the center, in that sella turcica over there, and the sphenoparietal sinus. The internal carotid artery and abducens nerve are located within the sinus. Also, cranial nerves 3 and 4, V1 and V2 divisions of the trigeminal nerve also run along the lateral wall of the sinus. And this is drained posteriorly by the superior and inferior petrosal sinuses. Lastly, on this video, we're going to go over the petrosal and sphenoparietal sinus. So here you can see the petrosal sinuses. So the superior petrosal sinus runs along the superior border of the petrous part of the temporal bone, and it connects the cavernous sinus with the terminal part of the transverse sinus. Meanwhile, the inferior petrosal sinus runs along the inferior border of the petrous part of the temporal bone, in between the petrous part and the occipital bone, and it connects the cavernous sinus with the internal jugular vein. There's also this sphenoparietal sinus, which is a small sinus that runs along the posterior border of the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, and it drains into the cavernous sinus.